we've got one last speaker, Joel Varty. He's been building websites and apps since the late 1900s. I appreciate that. I appreciate that reference. I'm in that club as well. Of course, now I've just lumped myself in with the, that just doesn't mean he's old, it means he's really old. Your kids, like mine, like to remind people of that all the time. Joel is the CTO at Agility CMS, where he's been leading the engineering and solution architecture teams, among other things. He loves evaluating web frameworks, building cool stuff, but also overachiever in other departments, football coach, musical theater, actor, director, basically the cast of Glee. Welcome, Joel Varty.
Thanks. Hey everybody, thanks for sticking with us right to the end. This is great. We're going to be doing a bit of a cage match with Next.js versus Astro. Can't wait to do it. Might as well do Mortal Kombat theme because late 1900s, this was peak, right? Who's in the audience today? Current developers, like you're working as a developer? Anybody? Yeah, most of us, okay. Software, anybody consider yourself like an architect? Okay, that's cool, that's cool. Any students? You got any students in the audience? So it's up to learn? Awesome, good to have you folks here. Should be fun. Get yourself a hobby, my most important thing. My hobby is football, watching football, doing all things football, my favorite thing. I'm a University of Guelph alumni. I'm so happy my son is actually playing there right now. Probably one of the best experiences of one's life. I also coach football, like folks were saying, and I like to do musical theater things. This is working, right? Yeah, okay. So there's me in a bunch of silly costumes and silly stuff. So be fun and have fun, but getting to technology. So what's my framework story? I've been in the industry forever. Not forever, though. But because there are stuff that I don't know. So I didn't do much of like C and things like that. But I did start off late 90s, Java, a little bit of C++ here and there. Did not love that. .NET, C#. So this was like how I built my career on .NET. So 2000s to the 2010s, there are still sites out there with code that I put in them for better or worse. Mostly for worse, because I have to then still maintain those things forever. Mostly in banks. Discovered the Jamstack. Anyone ever heard the term Jamstack? Okay, it's kind of like one of those terms that got thrown around, and it's kind of like, is it still alive? 2018, 2022, that really changed my career, because it was the first time I recognized that there are frameworks out there that can make my job as a web developer so much easier, especially as, hey, I work for a headless CMS, so I'm working with folks on solution architecture for how to build their websites. I can much more easily recommend things like these Jamstack frameworks than .NET, because .NET's it's a lot of lifting, it's a little harder to do. Front-end developers have a tough time with it. So looking at, a lot of sites were on like kind of, Gatsby was like one of the first ones that was super popular. I think Next.js is like state of the art right now. It's what most people are choosing. Astro is one of those ones that's out there, and I think with some of the stuff that's happening in the Next.js community, is it the solution of the future? It's a great question. We're going to answer that. There's also other frameworks out there. 11t is an amazing framework. In fact, Zach Leatherman is the creator of 11t. He's here speaking in a panel. That's why probably most people are over there, because he's a really cool guy. SvelteKit is amazing. Nuxt is great. Remix is awesome. I think Remix might be the future when it kind of solidifies. But you should learn from your past. And you need to kind of take experiments and understand that like when you build stuff, it's going to be around for a little while. And you're going to have to maintain that. So if you're going to change your framework, that's a pretty big deal. So you want to do lots of evaluation, but you can also try it out on like a personal site, or hey, the website of the corporation you work for. So in 2019, 18, we moved from .NET, the agilitysms.com website, from .NET to Gatsby, which was really cool. It was a rebuild. We did have a React front end on top of that, so it was not crazy to kind of lift and shift some of the front end stuff. But Gatsby.js is a static site generator, which means that anytime you change some content, you have to like rebuild the whole site, which actually isn't quite true, because Gatsby itself was an open source project that had a for-profit corporation called Gatsby Cloud. Well, Gatsby was a corporation, Cloud was the product, that you could do incremental build and preview, which was awesome. So we would publish or preview content, and it was ready in like 2 seconds, and it would be on the site. Really, really awesome. One of the best solutions I could have imagined. But guess what? Gatsby Cloud is gone. purchased by Netlify. The open source project is still there, so it works, but the solution now we're back to, it takes 2 minutes to build the site and all that sort of stuff, and preview is crap, right? So there's also some other stuff. So much JavaScript gets shipped down with Gatsby.js. So the homepage of Agility CMS was 6 megabytes of JavaScript and other stuff. And in case you don't know, that's bad. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. It goes very fast. Time to first byte is lickety-split, but 6 megabytes is like, no good. So moving on. Hey, let's use Next.js because it's kind of the thing that everyone's doing. So we just went through this, by the way, very, very recently. So it was a great chance. It's the exact same content from a headless CMS, so I really recommend looking at headless CMSs because you don't have to change all the content to change the front end. So that is cool. We're going to use the same routing. Agility has pages. Lots and lots of redirects, which is also an important part if you're evaluating a framework. How does it handle things like redirects is a really interesting thing. Can you read that? It's so small. Some size wins. So the homepage, which is a pretty long homepage, people like to put a lot of stuff on there, went from 6 megabytes to like 600K, just over 600K, including the images. So that was a really big win. Love that. Hosting is much, much easier. Okay. Well, of course, Gatsby isn't easy to host. It's easy to host a website on Gatsby because it's static. But it's the DevOps and build process that is really, really easy with Next.js for most sites. So you can host on Netlify and Vercel. Highly recommend looking at. You can use Azure, AWS, they have like sort of plug-and-play solutions for those. Works really well. Lots of different stuff there. Preview is built in to Next.js, so that was really awesome. Editors, it's called draft mode now, but it's like built in. They click preview from the CMS, and you can see it instantly. And then you just flip it in its publish mode. So really, really great for that. But I kind of got this weird feeling, right? It's starting to feel a little bit like .NET circa 2012, where it's like, man, it's a little bloated. Or, I tried this one thing and it changes how everything works. So I'm going to get into a little bit of that. But to me, that's why it's worth looking at Astro right now. Because I was a .NET guy forever. A huge chunk of my career, built a lot of what I would consider my success on .NET. But I understood that I needed to evolve to catch up with what things are doing. So that might be where you're looking at in your career. Or you might just be, hey, I haven't really dug into many frameworks yet. What do I want to pick first? So let's look at some stats. It's really good to do that. So every year Stack Overflow does like a developer survey. This is an interesting number. Front-end developers are people who identify first as a front-end developer are going down. So only 5.6% identify primarily as a front-end developer now. This number was much higher a couple years ago. I think it was like 10 or 12%. So certainly this is dropping. More people are trying to identify as full-stack developers, which actually fits right into Next.js and Astro because most of what you're getting from these things is not just front-end. You're getting a lot of server-side type things that if you are a front-end developer, that's okay because you're going to be able to figure that stuff out much easier. And we'll look at why. So I think that's not an alarming thing, but it is certainly different. Almost everybody is JavaScript. I think that in 62%, I think it's actually higher than that. I find hard to believe. But 38% are doing TypeScript still. I find that a little hard to believe that more people aren't using TypeScript, but those are good numbers. That's a big chunk of the industry. 18.2% desire to use Next.js. This number is dropping. Now, 4.8% desire to want to use Astro. That number is rising, but still pretty small. So it's like big player, niche, right? But maybe something we need to look at because admiration. Who really looks highly on Next.js, right? Only 59%, which is still pretty good, but then over 70% looking at Astro really favorably right now. So that's an interesting thing. I think it's worth looking. It was really looking at that number that made me choose to do this session today. So I'd say that's a good punch from Astro to Next.js if we were keeping track. But wait, why do we even need frameworks? Let's take a quick peek at that because it's a good question to ask. I won't spend too much time on it, but it is important, right? So think of a building, okay? If you're gonna build a foundation for a building, normally you have to start at the ground floor, maybe dig a basement for the garage or whatever. But a framework says you can start at the 20th floor. You don't have to reinvent all this stuff, but it's gonna give you a bunch of rules and opinions for how those floors were built that you can't change. So that's why it's an important thought, right? So imagine I'm at the 20th floor, so that's great, but maybe the windows are all tinted like a color I don't like. I can't change that, right? So imagine kind of like in a real world example. So it's a good thing, but it comes with some consequences. In terms of what they do, a lot of them are thinking, like Next.js, for instance, it's built on top of React, which is normally a front-end framework. but it gives you a server-side rendering, that's what SSR stands for, a server-side rendering way to build a UI with an opinion, okay? So it figures out the server stuff for you. It also gives you something called middleware. Both of these frameworks have something called middleware, which is a weird kind of term. Its middleware isn't actually in the middle, it's on the edge, so out on the CDN layer, which we'll look at more deeply in a second. What that means is you can have a bit of code that hits every single request going to your website that you can then make a decision on, and that's out at the edge in a CDN. And that's really good because before you actually get to your origin servers where you're close to your data, you can be closer to know like what's the region that someone's coming from and all that different stuff. So there's a lot of really good things you can do with middleware, and these frameworks have that built in as first-class citizen. The framework solves problems that you didn't even know you had. So it's important to know that they're doing a bunch of stuff in the background that you don't have to think about. But it is still happening, and you might break it if you do something weird. So that's also like a caveat. All right, so let's talk about a little bit deeper into just specifically Next.js. It is considered by itself to be the leading kind of React framework. And if you actually go to the React docs right now, it is the preferred framework for React, React 18 and probably 19, okay? So there used to be like a create React app, which was the way you would do React, and that was only front-end, like single page applications. Next.js is now the one, okay? So it's like really, really tightly coupled there. So that's an interesting thought. I think that's a bonus, but you could see it as maybe that's not the thing you want. Maybe you don't want to be into React so much because of that. It has RSC, which stands for React Server Components, which is really, really cool. PPR, which is partial pre-rendering and streaming. Okay, and streaming is an amazing thing. So imagine it's like you have a whole bunch of stuff in a request, but I don't want to wait for everything before I can start seeing something on my screen. So you can stream that down, and it does this for you. You don't have to build all this because it's really hard to build. Stream down like the husk of the page or the shell of the page, and then everything else gets injected into it. Okay, that's really, really cool stuff. It does that out of the box for you as long as you follow their opinionated way of doing it. So really, really cool stuff there. Has image optimization built in. This is interesting. It'll do that. It's interesting that it will do that on their servers. So if you host like on Vercel or Netlify, you can do the image optimization there. They really want you to do the image optimization there because they want you to pay for the compute, right? A lot of, if you're using a headless CMS or if you're using like a DAM, like a digital asset management library, something like Cloudinary or Binder, you don't need to do the image optimization on the servers of the people who want you to pay a lot of money to them for hosting. Okay, you can do it at the CDN. Almost every headless CMS does this, including Agility, but like Binder, Cloudinary, they all do it as well. So it's really interesting to look at image optimization. You don't have to use the framework for that. The framework can help you though. Edge middleware built in, okay? I'm gonna put a little asterisk on here because edge middleware and image optimization are like huge benefits of Next.js, but it's how a lot of people have been caught out on, with their bills going really high on Vercel. Because Vercel is a company that's hosting, they actually own Next.js. So Vercel sponsors and owns Next.js. Similar to how Gatsby Cloud owned Gatsby. I don't think Vercel is going anywhere. It's a great company. I know them, a lot of them personally. Lee Robinson is like one of the best developer advocates out there, amazing guy, but it is a for-profit company. That's something to keep in mind. Next.js is an open source project. They also are the main sponsor for Svelte. So they keep a lot of cool stuff going. It's a very opinionated way of hosting. I think Vercel is the best way sort of to host Next.js because they kind of know everything about this going on. So those opinions are best implemented on like a hosting platform like Next.js, so it's something to keep in mind. They changed the router completely from the pages folder to the app folder. So if you know Next.js, if you've been in that kind of crowd, that's a big thing. You like all of your old code now is like, well, okay, it'll still work, but that's not the way we do it anymore. That really upset a lot of people. Okay, I was upset for a long time. I do understand there's like a totally different approach. The whole streaming approach meant they had to rethink things, but it's like there's a lot of code out there that is kind of like null and void now and not as good. You can also start to think, is it starting to get bloated? This is a real big question, and this is like every software platform ever does this. It'll go through like growing, more features. Oh my God, it's fat, right? It's bloated, it's got, oh my God. And then you got to trim that, and maybe they're trimming off the thing that you really liked, or it's too bloated for you to do this simple thing that you really wanted to do originally. So it's something to really consider with frameworks. Digging into Astro now. On the flip side, calls itself the web you want. right? Total different approach. Little less opinionated, it's got these idea of islands. So you write stuff that runs on the server. You can do server islands. We'll talk about how that actually works in a second. But you can also do client islands, or you can have no client code in there at all and potentially deliver 0 JavaScript by default to the front end. Part of the thing about Next.js that when they went from pages to the app router is by default, a Next.js app was like Gatsby, where it would deliver all of the JavaScript that you could possibly need for that app down to the client. So you could get that 6 megabyte homepage potentially really easily without actually doing it on purpose, because Webpack would pack it all in there. So Next.js has kind of figured that out with the app router and minimized it, but with Astro you can get down, you can do 0 JS. If you don't need any client framework stuff going on, you don't have to have any JavaScript if you don't want. So that's potentially really, really great for performance. You can deliver, hey, my 10 kilobyte of HTML is all that I need. Maybe that's all you want to deliver, okay? But I also have these idea of islands, which is really cool. They have this new content layer, and I put an asterisk here because this is a feature. They used to have a thing called collections. Now they come up with a different thing called content layer. Interestingly enough, it's built by the same developer who worked on Gatsby's content layer, which was GraphQL, which was then purchased by Netlify as their Netlify's content layer. So it's interesting how these things kind of move around, but it's still a great feature. It's a really interesting idea about ways to kind of take content from places like CMS or e-commerce systems or product information systems, whatever, and bring that into your site in a way that makes a lot of sense. It actually does a synchronization and it puts it on a local database, which is really interesting. We'll learn about databases side of Astro in a second. So the content layer, I put an asterisk by. And then there's these things called hosting adapters, which is really, really interesting. So Next.js has a bunch of like hosting rules that a host would have to implement. Like Netlify, when they wanted to host it, they had to like implement a bunch of stuff and figure some things out. Same thing with, like there's Azure and AWS, they have the same kind of idea. Whereas Astro really documents all this in a very, very interesting way and makes it more of a standard way. So you implement the hosting adapter and it works on your like hosting platform. So a platform like Vercel or Netlify, it includes the CDN layer, the origin layer, and the build layer. So it does a whole bunch of stuff for you. And there's we're going to see more and more hosting adapters come out for Astro, I believe. On the flip side, it is also a for-profit company. Okay, they just came out with AstroDB, right? So it's like that content layer, that whole thing, that is probably going to be in AstroDB. I'm not really quite sure exactly how they do it. So it is an open source project, but it has to be funded by something, right? Somebody has to pay for open source, otherwise it doesn't innovate, right? So this isn't the only way it gets paid for. People sponsor it, but they are a for-profit company. I don't think this is a red flag necessarily. I think if it's not a for-profit company, I would think who's sponsoring it, who's keeping this platform alive that I'm going to base my career on. So it's an interesting thought. The content layer, it only updates at build time. What? I work for a CMS. The content that my customers put out, it changes like moment to moment, not build. I don't want to do a build every time something happens. That's ridiculous. So that to me, I have a problem with that. So it's an open source project. I put in a discussion. We're going to talk about it, and hopefully that will adjust. I don't think it really changes how you work with Astro, because you don't need to use that content layer yet, but it seems odd. It does have custom syntax, so the files are .astro files. So again, it has its own opinion for how to do stuff that you have to learn. I'm not sure if that's a bad thing or a good thing. You do have to ask, is it too early to use Astro? I would say no, but that might be a thing. Only 4% of people are using it. It's not as big. You're going to go on Reddit, Stack Overflow, things like that. There's not going to be as much. Now the flip side with Next.js is there's going to be a lot more, but for older stuff that's not related to what you're doing now. So I can see some heads nodding, you're getting it. So let's dig into, we talked about middleware. This kind of we have to talk about the request lifecycle and how does each platform actually attack that and solve the problem of the request lifecycle. So we have a CDN, we have an origin server, and then we have your browser. Okay, so when a request comes in from the browser, I actually have this written kind of wrong. It doesn't really make any sense, but the arrows don't make any sense. It comes from the browser, then hits the CDN, then goes to origin. Whatever. All right, let's look how Next.js solves this. So the CDN has a middleware. Again, with the asterisks, we'll go for that in a second. On the origin server, that's where your React server components are going to run. You can also have like just regular routes that can run serverless routes, but for the most part, your pages are going to be served up with React server components. So you're going to write React code, which is normally a client front-end framework now, but now you're going to write it so it runs on the server. So the console.log statements that are in the origin server stuff, that doesn't come out on the browser. It used to, actually, in the pages router, used to come both on the server and in your browser, but now it's just on your server's console. Okay, so in your terminal, those console logs will be there. That tells you that code's running only on the server. So if you do not have any like use state or use effect or anything like going on there, then that's a React server component. It's an async component. You can do asynchronous data access in there. Okay, so and then the sort of regular React client components are going to run in the browser just like regular React. So in the CDN middleware, you can do redirects and rewrites. Rewrites are super cool. So like I get /about-us that comes in, I can rewrite that to /contact-us page, but the URL doesn't change in the browser. What it just says is, hey, render this different path. Rewrites are really interesting. You can set headers in there. So something comes in from the middleware. Maybe I'm coming in and another good example for rewrite is if you're coming in from Europe, and you're at mysite.com, you come in from Europe, I can deliver you one page. So I go /Europe, whatever. But you come from USA or Canada, I can give you the /North America page, all with the same URL, right? So really, really cool. You can read the headers, you can set headers. It runs before the cache though. So if you write a lot of code in there, you are basically using up more compute on the CDN, and that is expensive. So, and this also depends on the host. So some hosts don't have to do it that way. If you read through the Netlify open source docs about their stuff, but they decided to do it that way because Vercel does too. It doesn't have to be that way. Again, React Server components, streaming and incremental static regeneration happens on there, which is probably one of the best things that Next.js did, was you have basically, it's really just standard caching, where you build it once on the server and it's built for a certain amount of time until that time expires, and then it'll build one version. You might have 1 million people hitting the site, but only one needs to get served out to the CDN at a time. So and there's caching galore. So the latest version of Next.js has so much caching in it, which we'll also talk about in a minute. That also happens mostly at the origin server. And then, of course, at the client, you're going to get regular React that runs there, but there's something called rehydration. So there's less rehydration than there was, but it is there. So there's like a bit of a time when that React app has to get built. Astro, very similar, has middleware. It's even called middleware.ts, same file structure for that. So same, redirect, rewrites, awesome. You can set headers. You can pass context variables. This is actually really nice. It's actually hard to pass a variable from middleware and Next.js to the origin server to like your pages. Super easy in Astro, I love it. Also again, how that's implemented does depend on the adapter, but most of the adapters out there are really good right now. On the origin, you have your .astro files. You have server islands, which you can write. Those run on the server. They allow for asynchronous data access. Awesome. The incremental static regeneration is manual, but I believe that control is good. Like, look up how does the cache control header work? How does stale while revalidate work? Look up those two things if you don't know what those are. Highly recommend looking into that for performance. You have the ability to set that yourself. On Next.js, you can't set those headers, those variables yourself. It's a bunch of weird opinionated things. That does tend to work out of the box, but sometimes it doesn't. And then on the browser, you choose your framework. So if you're a Vue.js person, you can write that with Astro. You can use Svelte. You can use whatever framework. You can use Alpine.js if you want. Or you can do Zero.js on the browser. So you have a lot more choice. So a little bit less opinionated about how you want to do stuff. So, and I think that control is something, especially when we get to like implementing HTTP standards type stuff, that Astro is a little bit more of a balance. Let's talk a little bit more about this middleware thing. So it runs at the edge. I don't know why we don't call it edgeware, but it's a bad idea. Middleware does come from like when you're writing express.js, middleware was a thing that's like, that's, you can implement it so it'll hit every single request that comes through. That's where that comes from. It has a limited API. It can't hit file system, do things like that. So it is very limited in what it can do. It does run before the cache. So you got to make sure that it's fast. If you're using up 100 milliseconds of compute, you're in some serious problems, okay? It does give you edge control. You adjust the headers and cookies. You can do personalization, like you can do internationalization. So that if you're building a site, use middleware for that. Redirects, rewrites, look into that stuff. Origin control, Next.js. So streaming makes everything a 200. Okay, so if you have pages that might be streamed and you say, hey, I want to redirect in that, you can't. It's not a 302 or 301. It's a 200 that comes out. So it ends up being weird. Whereas in Astro, you have the control. You can set headers at the origin server, which is a lot nicer. So there's a bit different there. I think Astro kind of has the win. So, there's some like give and take there. So it's hard to keep track. I haven't done a very good check of keeping score, but at this point, I would say score is kind of tied. There is, I'd say, equal. Like a lot of people are using Next.js, great community, lots of stuff going on there, but Astro is definitely the up-and-comer, so it's pretty close right now. But Next.js has some irritations that are starting to add up for me. From a hosting side of things, the Vercel thing does worry me a little bit, okay? Really like the company, but I've seen a lot of people have problems with costs. And I think that they've been treated right to try and correct those, but it seems like it's not something people understand, which tells me that the framework might be part of the problem there. Netlify kind of playing catch up, but is also a very good provider for Next.js, and like I've used both, I think they're both great. Netlify tends to be playing catch up though, so when Next.js 15 becomes full version and all that sort of stuff, will it be as good? You can also use Azure Static Web Apps if you're an Azure person. AWS Amplify is pretty good. Again, they tend to be a couple versions behind though, so it's maybe not the newest experience. There's also this project called OpenNext, which is supposed to help, it's kind of like an adapter for Next.js to kind of help other hosting providers work with Next.js. So again, it works in a lot of places, but it's starting to get a little icky on how this might work. It may get better, but I have a weird feeling that more people are just going to keep hosting it in a container and sort of lose out a lot of the benefits. There's some other weirdness. So there's like this idea of a static page versus a dynamic page. The idea there, a dynamic page, you cannot cache that. It's hitting the compute on every single request. Basically, if on the origin server, if you access a query string, it's dynamic. Like every single CDN in the world can cache that differently, but not if you're on a Next.js server. So there's ways to work around it with middleware, but weird stuff like that does come up when you're building a website, and that tends to add up. The idea that everything's at 200 if I want to redirect to the origin server, that's a pain. This is a big one. Fetch commands in Next.js 14, all cached by default, whether you wanted them to or not. So all your data fetches using the fetch command, they're caching, and whether they were even if they were in a secondary library that you didn't write, that caused some real annoyances. We had to write our new SDK for that. Now you can handle it, but should it have cached by default? I don't think so. When you're choosing, why do you choose Next.js? Because everyone else does it? That's not a great reason. That is a reason. It's not the best reason. You should be the thing that works for you. Have things changed? Are you innovating things versus preserving things? You got to think that about, okay? So there's some heavy fighting going on here. Talk about caching real quick. That caching with the fetch thing, that was very controversial, but it's really, really powerful too, because you can cache objects that then you roll up to be cached as a subset of a full route cache and a partial route cache, and I can invalidate that on demand. That is super duper party pooper powerful, right? Super powerful. I can have something cached for days and days and days, and as soon as that content changes, I fire a webhook, boom, invalidate the pages where all that might have been used, and now it's updated. That's awesome. Astro, that does have full and partial route caching, but you have to do it yourself with object caching and invalidation, which you can do, but it's a lot harder. So the control is yours. The other big difference, streaming versus server islands, and this is a choice. Next.js basically does React suspense on the server, and that turns a thing into like a streaming response. Really, really cool. You get partial pre-rendering like a shell, and then all of the dynamic stuff that is inside the suspense, that gets inserted after in a single streamed request, even though it might take a long time. So that's really interesting. Astro did server islands, which is a very new feature as of like July. So the idea is it generates a static version of the shell and then uses secondary, smaller requests, which are potentially longer, for all of the dynamic stuff that's coming through. So it doesn't use streaming. So an interesting change there. So I'd say the turning point, it might be coming real soon for these two things, for the switch from Next.js to Astro. I don't know that it's quite here yet, but I'd say it's very close. Very, very close. So let's go through it one more time. For maturity, Next.js definitely, it has the ecosystem, all of the different things. It's very mature. For features, absolutely. I'd say it's almost getting bloat though, right? Maybe too many features. For the docs, both docs are great. I would say it's a draw. Docs are great on both sides. For hosting, I'd say it's a draw for now, but the adapters is a much better model moving forward for more hosts being able to provide great competition for your hosting dollars. For CMS integration, super important for folks like me who run a CMS. Draft mode is built into Next.js, whereas you have to do that yourself in Astro. So if you want to provide like a good marketing experience for folks for websites that you're building, Next.js is a lot easier. Astro is not there yet. They have that content layer though, which is interesting. I don't know if it's going to be any useful yet, but it is an interesting thought. Caching, I'm going to give this to Next.js because it does it for you right now. Internationalization, I'm going to say it's a draw. That happens in middleware. It used to be built into the Pages router. You got to do it yourself now, but it's super easy, and I think with the rewrite, it's really easy to do. Future-proofing, trending Astro for 2025. I'm going to guess that this is where we're going to be making decisions on building sites with Astro. For innovation, it's a draw. They're both innovating really, really fast. If you're a React person, I do recommend Next.js. So if you're stuck into React, but if you're kind of React, like, I don't want to do React anymore, maybe Next.js isn't for you. For community, I would say it's a draw as well. So it's like really, really close. I think we're at a tipping point here with these two frameworks. So it's really, really interesting. They are firing shots at each other. The interesting thing will be, over time, will we even be able to tell the difference between them? Because there's a lot of similarities, middleware and all these different things. Will the caching catch up, draft mode? I think this is where we're kind of getting to where you can make a good choice on these right now. I think there's a lot of different things you can kind of choose between, but they're starting to seem very similar, which isn't necessarily a bad thing when you're switching from one to the other. And thanks for coming to my talk. That's all I have to say.
Get sound? Wow. Okay, well, that's fine. I see where I stand with these guys. That was amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a seat. We've got a few questions. We've got a little bit of time.
Awesome.
So I think Mortal Kombat. Let's talk about that as your choice.
Yeah.
I mean, were there other contenders before, or was that just really the only one that fit?
You know what? I started off with the whole I'm old thing, and then went back to the video games of the day, and like Mortal Kombat on like Sega. I think it was Sega. Yeah, that was the one. So that kind of stuck with me, and I was going to show I was going to do like newer and newer screenshots, and I'm like, it's really not that great of a metaphor anyway. But so we'll just go with the old ones. That's fair.
But I felt like I had to start with that one. So in terms of one for you, you started with .NET. That is opening up some painful memories for me from years past. But since then, as you've been moving through this, you've arrived at these two. What were some of the other sort of major contenders along the way?
Great question. So definitely, it was hard to let go of Gatsby because I, made a significant career investment in that one. So I don't feel like I got burned, but it's like, that was a lot of thought that went into that. Certainly, I went to Vue before React myself. That was one that I personally kind of gravitated towards. So I did a lot of work on Nuxt as well. Nuxt is great. I really like Svelte, but Svelte didn't have like a server-side rendering framework that really worked at the time. There's Svelte Kit now, so that's really interesting. I haven't looked much at it. So those are two that I spend a lot of time looking at and just kind of personally kind of going through. 11t is really, really cool. I really like the way that works and the idea that it's built more just on web standards as like let's learn how to do the old school web and just build a way to generate that in a really fast and efficient way. And I love that 11t has a lot of like non-web uses. You can use that to build PDF files if you want. So it's really cool as an idea. And I really support Zach in that work, and I love that he's kind of stuck with that as an open source project forever. I have a lot of respect for that, for sure.
I completely agree. I've used it for a lot. And Zach and I actually have a crossover with web typography as well. He actually used to be quite a bit more involved in that as well.
Right
on. Coming back to the frameworks, when you are starting a project, when you're starting an evaluation, what's the time where you think it's best to start honing in on the framework and the choice for a given project?
you need to, so if you're doing this for your career, you need to have this tool in your pocket and you need to know the ins and outs of it. You are looking for trouble if you're starting a project that a client is paying you for and you haven't written something yet. So you need to build your own site on that, like your personal site maybe is a good thing to start off as. I know for us, we have like a very pared down sample site that we use, and we would just rebuild it on different frameworks. Exact same front end, it's all Tailwind, so you can just copy and paste things around. And we will say, okay, does this work well? And some of them work really well. And that's how I discovered Astro, because it was just like, hey, heard about it, read about it on like, I don't know, Hacker News or something about like it had something cool, or I don't remember. But investigated it and used it. I haven't used it to build a site myself yet, but we've had some customers work on that. So I'm okay with recommending it as something they can try, but I will always say, don't let me tell you how to do your job. I'm a vendor of a platform that gives you data. I don't tell you that, but a lot of people do listen to what other folks say on this stuff. So I really understand that like people listen to their voice and say, they said I should use Astro or Next.js or whatever, but it's up to you to do your own, to do your own experimentation, play with it yourself, work with, see how it integrates, check out the libraries and SDKs that are for it. You can never do enough work, but you can know when you're comfortable.
I think that it comes back to this theme for me during the day-to-day around where do you make the decisions about the complexity of the thing that you're trying to build and how you're trying to build it. So somebody was asking the question around, you were talking about where you could put your Next.js project to get the most out of that platform. Any thoughts on hosting that yourself on-prem versus using one of these other things or a container or other ways of going about it?
So I have customers that do all of those things. They're more complicated and they're harder to maintain. That's the beauty of having a sort of all-in-one hosting provider. So, and you do have to tune the code a little bit for that, for a Netlify Vercel or like an Amplify or Azure Static Web Apps. Gosh, I'm sure there's other ones out there. But the fact that they do it all for you means a lot. So I'll just give you a story. We have a customer, it's a financial services customer, so like it's an enterprise type thing. They're all Azure, they're like, we want to have full control. And we need to have this, obviously they need to be in like multiple server farms and multi-region, and we need to have like geo load balancing and all of this stuff. And it's like, okay, we can do all those things. It gets more and more complicated. And then they have a service to copy the cache files between regions in case one region goes down and they don't want someone to serve old content. So it's like, now their hosting bill is thousands of dollars before anyone, like per month, before anyone even hits the website, okay? That's a lot. They want it, and they want that control, so they're okay with that. I would not recommend that for other folks, not because it doesn't work. It works amazing, and they get huge traffic spikes, and like Next.js holds up great. They have Cloudflare as their CDN, so it's like all custom stuff. But it would be much easier if it just like, hey, you could also just deploy it on Netlify, and they just take care of it. Or you could deploy it on Netlify and Vercel and these other things, and then use a CDN to go through those other things. Like there's so many easier ways to do this stuff now but until you try it, like I'd say do a proof of concept and see what it does. Make a staging or a UAT environment. That time is not building a website, but that is part of your job as a developer to understand how that's going to work. You have to know a little bit about the DevOps.
So with changes coming in Next 15, do you think that's going to change your opinion on where some of these pain points fall? Gosh,
I hope not. Probably. I think next 15 is actually a bit of we're going to backtrack a little bit on some of this stuff. Like there's an option to have cache not be default in fetch. I think they're out of beta with partial pre-rendering. But I would like to see a little bit more choice, but with choice comes bloat. This is where I'm kind of feeling conflicted, because as soon as you add more options, then that's more things for me to screw up or do wrong. So that I think it may be the turning point, honestly. Whereas like it just adds enough bloat that I feel that, oh man, I'm going to use Astro for new projects. So that's kind of where I'm sitting.
And so with that that decision point moving around, do you think that Next.js saves enough time to outweigh the control provided by Astro?
As of this day, yes. today, if I was starting a new site, I would build it. I did this already. We just did this. I would build it in Next.js, and I would basically try to make sure that all the things that are important to you and features that you have, that it does solve that problem very well. Moving forward, I would like to see a few more built-in opinionated things in Astro that would help with stuff, especially caching. The caching is the biggest thing for me right now. I can't tell you how important that is, and having seen that like with a CMS-driven website where you have a huge homepage with like, again, tons and tons of stuff on there that can all be cached, and then if I change one of those things, only that one thing gets changed, but the whole thing gets revalidated wherever that's used. Like, that is really hard to do. And the framework does that for you out of the box as long as you follow their opinionated ways of doing it, but it's super valuable, and I think that's one of the reasons to choose Next.js right now.
That was one of the things that, so for many years I was very heavily involved in the Drupal world, and starting in Drupal 8, they introduced something called cache tags.
Yeah.
And so for those who aren't familiar with it, it was the ability to invalidate even a very granular piece of the page, so that if only the name is the thing that changed on the landing page, you could invalidate that and have that regenerate rather than the whole page. So that seemed really sensible to me, and I'm not really sure if anybody has built that kind of capability. And is that closer to what Astro is able to do?
So that's what Next.js does.
Okay.
Almost every CDN provider has that, like, tags. So I know Netlify has it, Fastly, like all the ones that I've worked with, Cloudflare, they all have that at the CDN level. But doing that tag level stuff at the origin level isn't something that's easily done. I'm guessing that they're going to do that with their database product. So with AstroDB, you will get all that caching, and if you host it on on AstroDB, it will work for you at there. One of the things that's interesting that I think the Next.js team kind of messed up and backtracked on, they tried to put all the compute at the edge for a little while. They were saying, hey, host your site on like Cloudflare, which is like, that's at the edge, which is a mistake. Most of your compute should be at the origin because you can cache one version of it, not like 230,000 versions of it on all these edge servers, right? Doesn't make any sense for the origin type object caching. So I have yet to see how we do origin caching, like object caching, not necessarily full route caching for Astro. There's not a good way to do that yet, but I'm guessing that's coming this year. I would say in a V5, that will be a thing that will be really easy.
So I feel like this may be too big a question to ask with 2 minutes left, but you mentioned that Remix may be the answer in the future.
Yep.
What do you think is missing the most right now in that being the next contender in this next cage match?
Yeah, stability. So there's big changes that have happened version to version. Now they're going to rename it to React Router, which is really cool. It's interesting. So it is a React-based framework. So it's one of the ones that, like, on the React docs, there's Next.js and Remix as like potential frameworks that you can use. I believe it's going to be the most lightweight web standards type. It is the most lightweight and web standards type framework that you can use. And I think that once it matures a little bit more, we'll see more people use that to build websites that are much more lightweight, faster, and just easier to maintain over the long term. That's my guess. We'll see if it happens.
That's all right. That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Now, last question. There's an anchor for Next.js in a company like Walmart using it, or I don't know, Chewy. I think Chewy could be one of those. We're maybe a little smaller, but is there a company like that? Is there an anchor tenant for Astro that people might look at to?
Yeah,
to
they
be
have
an
some
example?
big names on their homepage. I can't remember some of them, but I really wish I did, because I just looked at this yesterday, but fish brain, they're gone. But yes, they are starting to get more of that coming. I think it's because of the control too, because there's really smart people and great engineers that work there that want that level of control. So if you're a little bit more junior, then maybe you want something that's very opinionated that tells you how to do your job, that you don't have to do all the ins and outs. But if you want that higher level of control, maybe a little bit more maintenance, because you're going to put some of your own logic into how that control works. But if you need the control and it's there, that can be a really good thing. So I think I think it might be NASA. I'm just making that up. I think it might be NASA on Astro or something like that. It's
We get a fact checker in here.
Yeah, one
on
of the
this?
big sites that's like tons of traffic definitely is on Astro. There's a few of them out that are really big ones.
I mean, NASA and Astro seems like it would go together.
Oh yeah,
but,
that's true.
let's,
Yeah.
just based on naming alone. Okay, there's actually a question from Phil that came in that a lot of people have been giving a thumbs up to. I think coming back to the caching stuff that we were just talking about, that Netlify and Cloudflare have been leaning into sort of framework agnostic cache headers, which should just work. I mean,
Yes.
shouldn't we be doing that rather
Yes.
than something that's just a Next.js solution?
Well, the cool thing about what Next.js does, though, is if it's built in, so that's the coolest thing about it, is that Next.js, when it works right, it is on the origin server generating those cache headers that are delivered to the CDN in a standardized way. So it just doesn't give you the control over them, right? So that it is following web standards, but it's kind of under the hood, which is a lot what .NET did back in the day, where you couldn't, back in .NET 4X, you couldn't control the headers very easily at all. It's really difficult to do that. This kind of feels like that. It's like, oh, we'll take care of it for you, don't worry. It'll be mostly web standards, right? But you don't know what it is under the hood as much. So it's trickier to tell. But you definitely know when your page stops caching and it's dynamic all of a sudden, and it's not caching at all. And now you're stuck. So now you wish you might have gone to Astro because you're trying to figure out how to backtrack with some of the weird opinionated stuff that you got to do.
Well, thank you. That's about the time that we've got for today. Thank you so much. This has been a great way to close it out. Only request is maybe more Mortal Kombat screenshots next
Right on.
time.
Okay.
I think.
All right.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.